Well, who better to ask than the first politician to join us in studio for 2013 on Taoiseach Enda. Taoiseach, thank you very much for being with us on the programme. I suppose you would get credit for being responsible for an easing of the panic, for pulling the country back from the brink. But as this government starts to feel the chill winds, if you like, of maybe increasing unpopularity, what people really want to know is, when is there going to be some let-up in the diet of austerity?
Well, first of all, the government were never under any illusions about the scale of the challenge that we faced when we put a programme together with the Labour Party following the election of 2 years ago. And think of where we were then, with jobs hemorrhaging, banks in a state of complete dysfunctionality, our reputation in shreds, hemorrhaging jobs all over the place. So we set out in implementing our programme to deal with a number of those issues. Clearly, the international response has been clarified in that they now know where Ireland stands in relation to corporate tax, in relation to being decisive in following through our programme and what we say. And that's evidenced by a continuous stream of investment into the country, by the interest rates falling from over 14% to 3% for the country.
And you've paid tribute to the people with for their courage, their patience and their quiet dignity. That was what you told the European Parliament. But what people want to know at this stage really, Taoiseach, is, when is your government going to stop squeezing their disposable income? It's
always a question of when. I'll deal with that in a second for you. Remember, in the 3 years prior to the government taking office, Sean, 250,000 jobs were lost in the private sector. 250,000. In the last 12 months, 12,000 new jobs have been created. So what we set out to do was to protect lower and middle income families. And that's why there was no income tax increase for anybody. And government, in its decision, both in respect of the property tax, in respect of the capping of tax relief for pensions over 60,000, has seen to it that those who are better off will pay more, including in respect of, as I say, for those with properties of over $1 million in respect of
yes, but people on very modest incomes.
But what we want to see, Sean, are more jobs and more jobs created. That's why it's absolutely fundamental that government now continue with its plan, which is working, to restore confidence in our indigenous economy and to make the decisions politically which will result in continued and further investment in small and medium enterprises.
It's working up to a point, because we have fewer people at work in the Irish economy now than this time last year.
Yes, but it's a programme for 5 years. I accept that the level of unemployment and long-term unemployed is much too high. I accept that the level of youth unemployment is much too high.
But I mean, is austerity working?
This is a case of the government having a mandate from the people to sort out our public finances, to restructure the way that business was conducted in this country, to continue to strengthen our reputation abroad, but also to restore a sense of confidence in Ireland. We've beaten adversity before. We are making very steady progress here. You have not heard me speaking of green shoots or turning corners or that everything is rosy in the garden. I've pointed out that what we're doing here is necessary for our country, and that's why people now at least have a sense of far greater clarity about the challenges that they face in the time ahead.
Part of the results of that clarity is that people are saving, those who can afford to, at levels much greater than before, and they're afraid to unlock those savings because they're fearful of what your government is continuing to do.
But it's much more clear what the position now is than was before, where there was no clarity at all. At least people now know that for 2013 they will pay half the rate of property tax. They know that water charges are coming down the track. They know that there will be no increases in income tax. So they have a far greater sense of...
But where are they to get the money? Where are they to get the money to pay that property tax? 50% this year and 100% the full whack next year.
This is an alternative to increasing income tax, which is a tax on jobs, which lessens the confidence even more. Government are very clear here, and we've set out to protect the lower and middle income families. We're doing that.
But how can you say you're protecting the lower and middle income families if you're hitting them with a property tax which is going to ask them for 250 this year and maybe and obviously twice that next year?
But you asked for clarity, and that's what's been given here. The IMF said the property tax should be at 0.5%. I heard wild allegations of people paying over 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 euro for property tax. It's at 0.18%. 92% of houses are worth less than 300,000. So people know they will pay half of the property tax this year and the full amount in 2014.
300 and 600.
Yes, but let me repeat again, this is an alternative to increasing income tax, which is a tax on jobs, which lessens spending power even more, and which does down confidence in our indigenous economy.
Do you accept the claims by particularly your own Dublin backbenchers, people like Olivia Mitchell, Owen Murphy and Mary Mitchell O'Connor, that this is an anti-Dublin tax and an unfair tax for Dublin residents?
No, I don't accept that it's an unfair tax. The bill has gone through the Dáil and been voted through the Dáil. It's fair in the sense that those with more pay more. Those with houses that are of greater value, particularly those with houses of over €1 million, will pay a proportionate 0.25% extra. And remember that 65% of this tax will be held within the local authority areas. There are no property charge for the first 3 years for new house buyers to give them an opportunity to get on the road here, and there are deferrals in certain circumstances.
Yes, but
it's a fair tax, and it's also certain.
An awful lot of people who are being asked to pay this tax had to borrow heavily to pay the stamp duty because they bought it at the top of the boom. Yeah. They're now in negative equity, and you're still asking them to pay even more property tax.
Well, the expert group that reported on this recommended clearly that there should not be a concession in respect of stamp duty.
But you're the government. I mean, you can decide. They propose, you dispose.
Sean, those who paid the heaviest price were those who bought at the top, and we increased the mortgage interest relief for those. And as I said, there's no property tax due for the first 3 years for first-time buyers. So we followed clearly the advice given in respect of the expert group, which said that stamp duty where it should not be conceded on here, and where those who did buy at the top of the property boom, they didn't have to pay that element of stamp duty because it had disappeared.
Talks are underway, Taoiseach, about a successor to the Croke Park deal. You're looking for an extra €1 billion in savings on the pay bill. Is that ambitious enough?
Yes, pay is 1/3 of what we require here, and over the next 3 years until 2015, Minister Howland's been mandated by government to achieve these savings. I'd like to say that we want to achieve those savings by agreement and consent where that's possible, and I hope that that can be achieved. And the reason that these savings are necessary, Sean, is to protect frontline services. And you can only go so far in all of these things.
If you can't achieve those savings by agreement and consent, what then?
We've made it perfectly clear that government have the right to legislate for changes that we need to achieve these savings. So the negotiations are underway. The programme has been set out by the Minister, and we hope that following the negotiations, which have a relatively short timescale, that consent and agreement can be reached here in everybody's interest and in our country's interest.
Will there be pay cuts if there's no agreement?
Well, what we've said is that government, of course, reserve the right to legislate for reductions in pay if agreement can't be reached. Now, we're talking here about overtime, about premium payments, about agency services, all of these areas.
What about increments? Should that be on the table? Will that be on the table?
The increments are worth about 200 million at the moment. Of course, these are all part of the discussions that Minister's conducting now.
But that's 690 million, according to one calculation, paid out in extra increments since the Croke Park agreement was originally agreed.
Well, as I said, the parameters of what we're trying to achieve here has been set out very clearly. 1 billion in extra savings by 2015. Those discussions are at an intensive stage now.
Why don't you have benchmarking 3? Because you were highly critical of benchmarking 1 and benchmarking 2 under the previous government.
Well, that's an option for the future, but not in the way that it was done before. Clearly, the system of benchmarking that applied years ago was one where all the evidence was destroyed afterwards, and you saw the results.
But presumably there are some records still there from the previous benchmarking too, the unpublished material.
We're involved now in intensive discussions here with the unions and their leaders, and I hope that that consent and agreement can be reached with the Minister and his officials who are involved in it now.
You've been very confident, Taoiseach, of getting a deal on the promissory note. That's the IOU to bail out Anglo and Irish Nationwide. What makes you so confident it's going to happen? Because you've staked effectively your entire political credibility on this now.
Well, our credibility is staked on the programme for government to implement it, restore our public finances, get our people back to work. I think we should bear in mind here that this not only is this complex and very detailed, but it shows you the hypocrisy of people saying you can sort this out very, very easily. It just has to be restructured. The fact of the matter is that politically we've gained the support of the European Parliament, the European Commission, the European Council, the IMF. The ECB, as we know, is completely independent of the 17 governors of the Eurozone countries, and it's with those that we continue to negotiate on what we regard as being patently unfair here. So what we want to do is to restructure these promissory notes so that the 3.1 billion, which has to be paid every year until 2023 and beyond at lesser amounts, that we don't have to deal with that, and that we can have it effectively changed from a serious overdraft to a long-term low-interest mortgage.
Right, so it's complicated and it's detailed, but this much is very simple. People could easily understand it. Will the deal involve a write-down?
Well, I'm not going to talk to you about the detail of and the complexity of what we're actually involved in.
No, that would be a broad stroke
But
answer,
suffice it to say that we hope to have a conclusion on this by the end of March that will not require us to pay 3.1 billion,
yes,
as was committed to in the promissory notes for 10 years.
What Patrick Honohan told the Oireachtas Committee on Finance during the week was that the ECB is not in the business of giving out grants. Any relief, first of all, any relief, in other words, a write-down, would come through another route involving governments. Are you on the path to getting that?
Well, we're dealing here with the ECB, which is completely independent. It's made up of the governors
and
of the
they're giving no
banks of the Eurozone countries. What we're looking for is a restructuring and a re-engineering of the promissory notes put in place by the previous government, very complex, very technical, that will not require us to pay 3.1 billion at the end of this March and for the next 10 years.
In other words,
that's what they left us with.
A longer payback time, Taoiseach, a longer mortgage, to use your own words, and a cut in the interest rate, perhaps?
A much longer mortgage and a much reduced situation where we have to pay our debt. We will be paying the lot. We don't want to pay 3.1 billion every year till 2023, and that's what we're trying to re-engineer and restructure. And we've made that very clear to the ECB. We've had our economic experts, our legal experts, our financial experts, and we're continuing that negotiation. And I do hope that we reach a conclusion to it before the end of March.
Taoiseach, there was a big anti-abortion rally in Dublin yesterday. 25,000 people turned out in the cold. Are you in any way surprised by the size of that protest and indeed the intensity of the Catholic Church's opposition to what you're proposing? They really have come out swinging, haven't they?
Well, I met with the Cardinal, a number of bishops and members of the clergy the other day as part of the structured dialogue with government. I found the meeting very constructive and very realistic. Let's be clear on this. I'm not in the business of liberalising abortion. I'm not in the business of legalising abortion. What we have here are rights established by our Constitution and determined by the Supreme Court. And we're also clear that we're in breach of the European Court of Human Rights because we haven't supplied clarity in respect of the C case. So what we're at here in terms of government, in a realistic, respectful, humanitarian way, is to put a framework and give legal certainty to people who work in the medical profession where an intervention is necessary, where there's a difficulty with a pregnancy. And that includes the issue of suicide, because the Supreme Court determined that that's part of what the article in the Constitution actually means.
Are you rejecting the charge by those protesters that you're effectively breaking your promise not to introduce abortion?
Sean, I'm receiving correspondence and messages from all over the country. I'm now being branded as being worse than Herod. So what I want to do here is to implement
Are you saying, though, that
are
you saying you're not breaking a promise?
I am not in the business of liberalising abortion. I am not in the business of providing abortion on demand. What I have a duty to do as the head of government is to see that we provide legal clarity and certainty for medical personnel, and that we introduce restrictions and regulations in regard to the question of suicide, which is difficult.
What about Fine Gael TDs who feel honour-bound to keep the promise they thought the party made? Why should they be threatened with expulsion from the party if they don't support your measures?
Well, let me repeat again for you. The Constitution, Bunreacht and Heron, is the people's book. And that book contains the Article 43.3. And that article has been determined by the Supreme Court as to its meaning. And its meaning gives rights in respect of a termination of a pregnancy. And it includes the question of suicide. I have a duty and a responsibility to put clarity around what is a legal situation where there are no regulations at the moment. I am not in the business of liberalising any regime of abortion or introducing abortion on demand.
What about the
legislation here, which will give rise, Sean, to the regulations, is strictly, very strictly, on the narrow line of what our Constitution means.
Okay.
The Constitution, as you know, was voted on by the people.
But just one other question on that one. You're proposing to change the 1861 Act, which criminalises abortion. There's talk of repealing the relevant sections. What are you going to put in its place by way of deterrent?
Well, what we want to do here is amend those two sections as part of the legal base upon which regulations will be introduced by the government. Now, we've put in place a process here. We said before the election that we would appoint an expert group to look at the ABC case. We did that. That was debated in the Dáil. Then we put in place information hearings conducted excellently by Deputy Buttermore, and those information findings will be sent now to the Minister. A structure will then be put in place whereby the heads of the bill will be produced, brought back to the committee, debated in the Dáil.
But will there be a deterrent in that amendment of the 1861 Act?
Well, put it this way, Sean, I'm not going to have a situation where somebody with respect can set themselves up as a psychiatrist who's in the business of referring people for abortion. And in that particular issue, this gets down to a very narrow line, that in cases where suicidal tendencies are evident and determined by qualified psychiatrists. Right, but it's only in the case of where the abortion is the only treatment that could save the life of the mother.
And will there be any criminal sanctions for people who don't keep the law?
Well, that's a matter for the government to decide, but we're not going to have a situation where people can assume they can refer on these things. But I think it's important to say this, that what we're about here is actually saving lives, because the medical personnel have two patients, both the mother and the unborn child. And it's very important that we treat this with the sensitivity that it deserves, and that people who are involved here get the very best level of treatment, the very best level of understanding, and the very best level of consideration. So what we're at, in essence, is putting a framework of legal certainty and clarity around a situation where there are no regulations at all now.
One other last question, Taoiseach, the Horseburger story. The Sunday Times today reporting that imported ingredients from Europe were not used in the production of the Tesco burgers found to contain 29% horse meat. So are you satisfied there's no scandal, no domestic scandal in this regard?
Well, I'm not satisfied that we've come to the end of this yet. There's a process in train here. These are very forensic tests. And what we do need to find out is what is the truth of the matter. I've seen different reports now in respect of this issue, which is a matter of reputation for our country. We've gained enormous respect internationally for the exceptionally high standards that we have here. That's why these things were discovered in the first place. The process of analysis and examination is ongoing, and that will determine what was the cause of this, where it came from, who was responsible, and then we can deal with it.
But if the stuff wasn't coming from abroad, where was it coming from?
I've read those reports. That's why we're involved in a process which will determine the truth, where it came from, who was responsible for it.
So did Simon Coveney get a bum steer, your Agriculture Minister, on this?
Simon Coveney has been very much on top of this and has been upfront with the people insofar as the truth is as we know it. The process is continuing, and when we have the final evidence, the Minister will publicise that immediately. He's been very clear on the process from the FSAI to the Department of Agriculture to the tests in Germany, and we're continuing that to find out what the exact truth actually is.